Good afternoon and welcome to Generous Futures Protecting Democracy. My name is Tanya Rumble and I'm the Executive Director of Development for the Faculty of Arts and Yellowhead Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University. We are so excited about this panel today and I can't wait to hear from this esteemed group of colleagues. But before we begin, I'd like to start us with a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is not perfunctory, and I hope it will ground our conversation today regarding democracy. Can we really speak about democracy or the civic and democratic process without the context and history of Indigenous people? And while the ability and right to vote came at a much later time for Indigenous peoples, tribal and clan democracy has been a long-standing and persistent traditional structure. And it's also important to acknowledge the catalytic and central role of Indigenous people in contemporary civic and social justice movements. TMU is located in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them together to share the territory and protect this land surrounding the Great Lakes. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank our lead sponsor for the series, the TD Bank Group, for helping bring Generous Futures to all of you. We simply couldn't do this without TD's support. And today we're looking at the role that philanthropy plays in preserving the institutions and processes that underpin our growing democracy. We'll look at some of the challenges and obstacles in using charitable support for initiatives that strengthen democracy and how the corporate sector is or isn't advancing non-partisan engagement of communities and civic life. So the plan for the next 45 minutes is pretty straightforward. After we have a chance to hear from each of our panelists and engage in conversation, I'm going to do my best to get to some of the questions that folks who registered and pre-submitted at the time of their registration. And so without further ado, I'm really delighted to introduce you to these panelists. So first, I would like to introduce Sabrina Dellin. Sabrina is the Executive Director of the Samara Center for Democracy, a nonpartisan registered charity with a mission to realize a resilient democracy with an engaged public and responsive institutions. For over a decade, Sabrina has directed multi-stakeholder research and outreach initiatives that have made an impact across justice, academic, and nonprofit sectors. Sabrina has appeared as an expert witness before parliamentary committees on matters relating to political participation and frequently provides commentary about democratic engagement for various media outlets, including the Globe and Mail, CBC Radio, and the Toronto Star. She is also the host of Humans of the House, an amazing podcast that I encourage you all to listen and download that explores the lived experience of former members of Parliament. Welcome, Sabrina. I'd now like to introduce Noah Mendelsohn Aviv. Noah is the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. She has directed both the CCLA's Equality and Freedom of Expression programs, writing and appearing and advocating on such issues as refugee protection, 2S LGBTQI plus rights, racial profiling, reproductive justice, freedom of expression, religion, and the intersection of rights. Noah has stewarded litigation for the organization, including the CCLA's Bill 21, abortion access, and solitary confinement challenges, as well as dozens of interventions in courts across the country. Welcome, Noah. I'd now like to introduce Sharon Avery, a proud TMU alum and president and CEO of Toronto Foundation. Sharon Avery has championed the new philanthropy, an inclusive, participatory, and power-shifting approach to charitable giving and grant making. With Sharon at the helm, Toronto Foundation has become a gathering place for diverse new philanthropists, community organizations, and grassroots leaders to embark on learning journeys and building partnerships to create and fight for a more equal, equitable city. Under her leadership, the Foundation has introduced programs such as Vision 2020 and Vision Next, aimed at mobilizing next generation philanthropists, as well as the Trust Collective that is focused on investing in women and girls and harnessing the potential of social impact investing. Welcome, Sharon. And finally, I'd like to introduce Leslie Wu. Leslie is a respected city leader with over 25 years of experience building sustainable communities and shaping urban development in Canada's fastest growing urban region, the Greater Toronto Area. Leslie assumed the role of CEO at Civic Action in 2020, an auspicious time to take the helm. Civic Action is the premier civic engagement organization that convenes, establish and rising leaders from all sectors, backgrounds, lived and professional experiences. Civic Action catalyzes actions and impactful solutions to address pressing challenges in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and well beyond. Before joining Civic Action, Leslie was Chief Planning and Development Officer at Metrolinx for over a decade. Welcome, Leslie. We have a truly incredible panel, and I wish we had much more time with them. And so in the interest of the precious time that we do have, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to start us off today by sharing their answer to the same question. And so I'm going to start with Sabrina, and then we'll hopefully then continue on to Noah, Sharon, and then followed by Leslie. And I'm going to ask you each in about a minute or so, why is it so important to bring together a conversation about philanthropy, generosity, and democracy at this particular moment in time? So Sabrina, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thanks, Tanya, and it's such a pleasure to be on this panel. So for me, I'm thinking about low public trust in elected officials, the spread of misinformation online through social media, and signs of social polarization that are all major variables that are challenging Canada's democracy today. We're in a period of global democratic backsliding where we're facing challenges that are urgent and complex and related to trust, risk, and knowledge. And philanthropy is about addressing the root causes of complex social problems and making life better for people. And it's enabled through giving that is generous and varied. There are a lot of different forms of contributions there, but they can only have a meaningful impact if they're made within the context of a healthy democratic culture. And so that means public confidence and engagement with our institutions, elections, scientific fact. Recently, the heads of several Quebec-based foundations wrote about this in a piece for La Presse. They talked about how without reliable information and public trust, the tremendous capacity of philanthropic actors can't be leveraged. And so an examination of these two things is very timely and important right now.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you for highlighting that wonderful La Presse article. I think that's important context that you've offered. Noah, I'm going to now turn it over to you. Why is this particular moment in time so important as we bring together the intersection of philanthropy, generosity, and democracy?
Thanks very much. And I'd like to echo what Sabrina said in saying how important and timely this panel is and how much I appreciate being here on behalf of CCLA. A lot of people think that democracy is what happens every few years during a federal or provincial or municipal election, territorial election. But democracy is much more than that. Democracy means that every person has the right to participate and have their voice heard, and to have the rights and freedoms that are necessary to give them the capacity to have a meaningful voice in the decisions and the laws that affect every single person in this country. Rights and freedoms, therefore, are part and parcel of democracy. And every person should be empowered and engaged and have those opportunities. And that's a big part of what we do. Why is it critical right now? Because as Sabrina was saying, we're seeing the same backsliding democracy under attack in many countries around the world, and not just outside of Canada. We're seeing polarization, we're seeing mobilization against rights, we're seeing anti-rights movements right here inside our country. And large-scale philanthropy, very small donations, everything in between, participating, contributing in every way possible means that everyday Canadians can contribute and participate to the project of protecting democracy, protecting fundamental freedoms through organizations like CCLA that needs it and others.
Thank you, Noah, for highlighting both the urgency of this conversation, but also the kind of benign, everyday role that we each have in the stewardship of our democracy. And so, Sharon, I'll turn it over to you. I think you'll have something interesting to offer from the perspective of philanthropy and why this conversation is needed at this particular time.
Thank you, Tanya. And it is, you know what, it's my favorite part about this panel. We're all women, just saying, well done, TMU, for bringing us together. So, you know, the question, why this conversation, philanthropy, generosity, democracy now? Because all three of those things are in peril. And some of those things are being used against other parts of these things. So we're, you know, I think for us at Toronto Foundation, trying to harness the power of philanthropy in terms of the collective engagement, civic engagement, in order to be influencing where money's flowing, where power's flowing. All of these things are connected to democracy. And I think Noah said it really well. A lot of folks out there think that being part of a democracy means voting, but it is so much more. And the research we did in 2022 is showing that donations and volunteering in Toronto and beyond, we did a national sample, are down 25% since pre-pandemic. And when you aren't engaging in your community, you aren't connecting, you aren't building trust, you aren't having a sense of belonging, you become apathetic about all of the other pieces. And we collectively need to do something about that. We need to solve all three, or we need to engage in all three to see change.
Thank you, Sharon, for highlighting how much social capital is connected to the participation in philanthropy, both at a large or grassroots level. Leslie, for the final word, why are you passionate about these topics, and why is this conversation imperative at this moment?
Thanks so much. And it's really hard being the last person because so much has already been said. So I'll try to be additive and not duplicative. I think we sit at a very, very dangerous point in time right now. The multiple crises that we are all experiencing, you name it, whether it's the economy, the environment, society, and the decline of so much of the social infrastructure that Canada and our city and our region is known, is at a breaking point, and we're feeling it. We're all feeling it, but at the same time, Sharon talked about the apathy. It's not necessarily the most mobilizing for our folks when all of this is coming at us all at once, and so philanthropy plays a really important role in supporting the understanding that the solutions to these multiple ills that we are facing cannot happen by only one sector, by the public sector or the private or the not-for-profit sector. It requires the generosity of others to believe that we can work together to fix what needs to be fixed. And so when we think about the democratic system, which is around a premise that we can understand the views of everyone, the support that we need to enable the everyone to participate in the discourse is not only that all voices are in the room, it's an understanding of to learn how to navigate difference in order to come to solutions in a transparent way. And so a lot of the work we've been doing at Civic Action, in particular with rising leaders, is equipping folks how to navigate in a democratic society where not everyone is going to agree on everything, but we understand how to have respect and move forward. And so never before has this kind of convergence of so much difference happened in all different dimensions. And never before, I don't think here in Toronto, I've been in this city and this country for several decades, have I seen the need for the generosity of philanthropy in order to support organizations that are doing the work that the free market and public policy cannot address. Never before have I seen the need for creating more capacity to understand how to operate in a democratic system. I think we have lost the ability, the civility that we talk about. And I think there are so many forces that are pushing against what I just described, that philanthropy needs to play a large role in pushing back. Sabrina early on talked about misrepresentation of facts and information. Social media algorithms are creating a whole other universe of beliefs that philanthropy needs to actually step in, because government is not going to do it quick enough. The private sector is not able to do it quick enough. And even social not-for-profits and their advocacy, just advocacy alone is not enough. So it's urgent. I think this conversation hopefully goes from a conversation to action, but these are very, very fragile times.
Thank you, Leslie. I think you've beautifully highlighted the importance of a multi-sectoral or a unisectoral approach, and that no one sector is well positioned to address the perils of our democracy that you've all sort of articulated. There are these fissures, right? There's these cracks in the bedrock of our democracy, and left untended, they will turn into chasms where we will be unable to practice the active listening and relating to one another. Leslie, as you so beautifully put, that ability to relate and understand the diversity of perspective, lived experience, and thought, I think is so important to what you're doing at Civic Action. And so now I think I'll turn it over to you, Sabrina, and would love to hear a little bit more, and from each of you in tandem. But tell us a little bit more about what the Samara Center for Democracy does, and how is philanthropy playing a role in your work?
Yeah, happy to. The Samara Center for Democracy is a nonpartisan registered charity, and we want to make it easier for people to talk about and participate in politics. And the way we do that is through evidence-based initiatives that are designed to engage a wide range of people. So that can include educators, policymakers, journalists, public leaders, and the electorate as well. We recently released a 6-part podcast series called Humans of the House. Thanks for mentioning it, Tanya. And in it, we weave together interviews with a dozen former members of parliament so that they can demystify what life in the role is really like. And we're also engaged in looking at technology's influence on our democracy with our Sandbot project, where we measure toxic and abusive sentiment received by candidates and political parties in Canadian elections. Our work is largely funded by donations, from major gifts to dedicated monthly donors, which we're so grateful for. Philanthropy then is a major part of our world, and it is a key priority in my role as executive director to secure sustainable funding for our operations and projects. So for me, this is about communication, and taking the time to build relationships that align with our values and our goals of securing a vibrant culture of civic engagement in Canada. And as a lot of nonprofit EDs can relate to, this requires a lot of different skills, hard and soft, and all the while prioritizing serving our mission while balancing being responsive to a range of different financial supporters.
Thank you, Sabrina. So philanthropy is both a catalyst, if I'm hearing you correctly, is a catalyst for your work, but also integral to the work. It's the process, and it's also part of the thrust of your mission. So thank you for sharing more about Samara. Noah, I'm going to turn it over to you now to also share more about your organization. Could you share with us how the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is mobilizing for democracy, rights, and freedoms? And frankly, what's at stake if we don't support these things? And if you want, you could also highlight how are donations from everyday members of our community helping to support the work of the CCLA?
Thanks very much. It's an important question. Just gonna make sure that my mic is on. It is. CCLA is a surprisingly tiny organization. We are also non-governmental, non-profit, independent. We also get most of our donations from individuals, almost all of them actually. And through those, our tiny but excellent team allows us to litigate, to engage the public through the media, to run our phenomenal education program that focuses on critical thinking for rights and freedoms, that creates more engagement, more empowerment of young people and of newcomers and other community groups. So those are some of the ways in which we engage. We also engage with coalitions and networks of people who are doing the same, and with experts as well across the country. And in some situations, we mobilize by supporting and amplifying, and in some cases, we lead the charge, and we have to lead the charge because sometimes there's nobody else, for example, to challenge the province of New Brunswick for reproductive justice and the fact that there isn't appropriate access to abortion care in that province. Sometimes it falls to us to litigate against the practice of prolonged solitary confinement, which the UN had said could cause serious mental health illness. And we were the ones who had to do it, and we took it on and we fought that. So our issues span the full breadth of democratic rights and freedoms. It goes everything from democratic discourse. So we have a case about individuals, a law that said that individuals cannot discuss public policy issues for a full year before an election, to racial profiling, to the rights of trans youth, to privacy, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, criminal justice. We've been doing a lot of work about bail and who gets held in prison before trial where they have not been convicted without bail, the lack of almost any regulation about the use of strip searches, freedom of expression in so many areas, the rights of protesters and bloggers and activists on issues that we like and issues that we don't like, but the freedom of expression to be a dissenter, to have a different voice. There's a great deal more that we can and should be doing across the country, but we have a team of 4 people in our advocacy team and 2 people in our education program. So we do need to grow, and the role of philanthropy, whether it's big gifts or small ones, is to allow us to do our work, to grow our work, to protect our rights and freedoms and the rights of others. And the last thing I want to say on this is that we know how Canadians are thought of and how we think of ourselves. We think of ourselves as decent people, compassionate, caring. We care about social cohesion and decency. And in that same framework, people in this country care deeply about human rights. And that's why I think people want to protect not just their own rights and freedoms, but those of everybody. And we also understand that the freedom of no one is safe unless the freedom of everyone is safe. And philanthropy, big or small, allows people to be part of that and to engage directly.
Noah, you've so beautifully articulated the kinds of protections and defense of democracy that CCLA is engaged in. And I think I'll tag on to what you just said there in terms of small and big, because I think when we hear the term philanthropist or philanthropy, we think of it as big P philanthropy, which I hope, Sharon, it's a good segue to you, is you're doing a lot of groundbreaking work at the Toronto Foundation. You're in the role of a grant maker, but also a convener, and probably 10 or so other hats that you could probably say the foundation and you personally have. So could you tell us a little bit about what is the new philanthropy approach that you're championing, and how does this approach intersect with the kind of democracy that we just, Noah and Sabrina and Leslie have articulated?
So I guess I would start with a statistic that from the moment I took this role almost 7 years ago has haunted me. And that is that in Canada, 66% of all donation revenue goes to the top 1% of charities in this country. And what sort of my simplistic way of expressing that is the biggest money goes to the richest charities. And so, but you've just heard Noah and Sabrina give you a ton of amazing reasons why they should receive funding, but that the funding imbalances in this country are massive. And so when I took over this role, we have now almost 1,000 fund holders. These are folks from all across the city. And as you pointed out at the beginning, Tanya, a whole bunch of new, young, diverse, first-gen Canadian folks who've set up funds in a collaborative way, not in an isolated, individualistic way that philanthropy often happens, but with the desire to work as a community to support the organizations that don't get funded, but are working on the most intractable issues, that are mobilizing, that are advocating. And increasingly, that whole space is of interest to us in terms of revealing it to the philanthropists that we work with. So why, so the new philanthropy for us is really about shifting power. And pardon me, but just because you're rich doesn't mean you know where money needs to flow. And so how can we play a role in supporting shared learning between, for, and with the sector, with community at the grassroots level? Our work, we have a philosophy of never working alone, and we want to create a real sense of belonging. And all of these are the ingredients of grassroots democracy, because the best kind of democracy happens from the ground up, not from the top down, right? And so for us, we feel we have a very clear role in trying to convince and introduce the kinds of work that Noah and Sabrina and Leslie are doing to folks who have the interest in partnering on making real change in a very untypical way. So I think that the one other comment I just want to make about our earlier conversation that it sort of came up as I was listening to Leslie in the end, is the other thing about philanthropy that's really bugging me right now is how the tools of philanthropy are being used to fund the pushback. So everything that Noah is trying to achieve with human rights, there is movements raising money from passionate Canadians to push back. And so there's a real tension in philanthropy. And I haven't figured out what that means with my team and with Toronto Foundation going forward, but I feel like there's another reveal that needs to happen there. And being really honest with ourselves that there's lots of generosity happening for the pushback. Now, maybe that's a whole other conversation, Tanya, but I just put that out there to be provocative.
No, Sharon, I think that hopefully will be a thrust of this conversation, because as we can see, there is a very active and vigorous movement against trans rights that is well funded. And there is that tension, as you have beautifully articulated, that exists, or a reticence on the part of many folks that are in a position to give, to support movements that have a distinct point of view. And so I think your comment around helping to reveal the intractable issues and the organizations that are often in the margins doing the hard, heavy lifting of addressing that last mile in some of this civic engagement work, I think is really powerful. And I'm glad that Toronto Foundation sees their role as the revealer, or someone that can help illuminate those intractable challenges. So Leslie, I know poor you're at the end, and so you have to sum everything.
It's okay. My surname starts with a W, so I'm used to being towards the end of any list. It's okay.
Oh, wow. Exactly.
It's what makes me stronger.
Absolutely. Yes, indeed. And so, in your role at Civic Action, you were equally engaged in these conversations from a slightly different orientation to what Sharon is doing, but would love to hear what are some of the ways in which civic engagement is catalyzing action and solutions to help protect democracy here in Canada. And what do you see as the role of philanthropy in supporting civic engagement and civic movements?
Thanks so much for the question. And for those who don't know Civic Action, we are a not-for-profit and a charity. We are going into our 20th year, and our mission explicitly is about boosting civic engagement to build better, more inclusive cities. And so all of our work is directed towards that energy, but from the lens of who's at the table, is there transparency about where decisions and how decisions are made? Because if you can't see through into that, it's very limited how engaged you can actually be, because on the surface, the opportunities for engagement are prescribed by what government consultation is, or as was said earlier, well, I can run for office, which is also a valid way, but there are so many other ways. And a lot of the work that we have been doing is this ability, we've been doing, this is what we work hard is at, the ability to build the relationships to enable and be almost like a guide and a navigator to cross between different partisan views, different sectors, and different industries. And it is the relationships that we build that then we afford and share with others that enables more lines of communication to happen. That to me starts to build the possibility that we have a more robust and respectful platform for democracy. So that's sort of one part of our work. We have two other kind of core pieces of work that we do in the context of building more civil society. Many folks know more around our work, which is really around guarding the future of the city and the leadership that is needed to take us forward. And by leadership, I mean that broadly. We support a lot of programs explicitly looking at rising leaders who already on their own accord have put their mark in their community, or have identified and been successful, but are what I would call stuck. They need to get to that boardroom table. They need to get to that council chamber. They need to get into that parliament building. And so we spend a lot of time helping them learn from established leaders what it's like there, because many of us, especially if you don't have multi-generations in this country or access, it's hard to understand it. And nothing, you can learn as much as you want out of a book, but learning from others' experience is one of the best ways. So we have a series of leadership programs that very much focus on enabling and strengthening and giving rising leaders the capacity to navigate, to have a cohort and a network that is of peers that they can rely on as well. The second sort of area where we build civic capacity and engagement is through our work that we do on a kind of 4-year cycle around major urban challenges. It's called a summit. The organization was founded on a summit. It's the convergence of hundreds of leaders from the private, public, and not-for-profit sector with a mind to saying, and this is happening in October for us, we're doing this next month, to saying there are many people, all of us, leaders here striving to do good things, but we can probably do a lot more together. Over 20 years, that has really created things like Luminato, TRIAC. Civic Action was one of the first organizations to partner with Bell in the early days when mental health was less on the radar than folks, things like energy conservation in the downtown. So we have seen the power of the convening, this curated convening. It is empowering, it mobilizes, and it gives folks the hope that the ability, the boost they need to understand that you are more than one voice if you are surrounded and connected to all these other folks. And so it's a building block, I think, to democracy, and philanthropy plays a role because this is the convergence of individual passions and translated into money, corporate commitments, sometimes government, sometimes other foundations, and that's how we support our own work. It's kind of a diverse portfolio, which represents kind of and reflects the kind of work we do, that we have support from so many different areas. So I think I'll stop there because I could literally be talking for another 3 hours.
Thank you, Leslie. And as a early graduate of the Diversity Fellows program, I can attest to the power of the network that Civic Action creates around your rising leaders. And I think, I think it's really important that you highlighted the intrinsic assets that exist within communities, and simply seeing your role amongst many things as a way to mobilize resources to enable, to unstick people that otherwise have the solutions, knowledge, lived experience, insights, and wisdom to move forward some of these intractable challenges. And so some archetypes I think are forming in my own mind around the roles that each of you play, and I think you can all play them in different ways, whether it's guide, illuminator, defender, and translator. And so Sabrina, I think I'd be interested in hearing in your role often as translator, taking research and turning it into something that people can action. What are some of the challenges that you've observed around policy development and public engagement? Because there's an opacity to public policy. The term itself often, creates some resistance for people to want to engage. And so what do you think it means in terms of our ability to adequately fund democracy, building projects when it comes to policy development and engaging our public in those processes?
Yeah, it makes me think of the term policy wonk, which, this much of our population is aware of what that means, and an even smaller amount identify in that way. And that's a point of pride and a status indicator. So that's a whole subculture that maybe we can unpack in another conversation. But, we're talking about all the different challenges that our democratic culture is contending with right now. And a big one that we're focused on at the Samara Center is the role of technology, specifically social media platforms, and how they're facilitating the spread of hate and misinformation online, and how this is distorting our public sphere, and then by extension, our social norms. And then that's all taking a toll on civic engagement. And a major impediment to sustained and high quality public education is that mis and disinformation, and it is connected to that policy development element. So I think, and we at the Samara are really keen to see more deep investment in education, particularly information and digital literacy, public libraries, classrooms, in addition to nonprofit organizations, all have a critical role to play in helping us recover from the pandemic, particularly the learning loss that's been endured by young people who have had their ability to become active citizens hindered. We need also a strong local media in order for the public to have reliable access to information that can present the nuances and unpack how policy development actually happens and why it matters, what the personal connection to it is, how it relates to your community, the people that you love. Unfortunately, journalism job cuts are increasingly common, and so that's another thing to add to the list of what's in peril. We also need spaces, both digital and physical, that support substantive public engagement and that are free from harassment and abuse. I mean, effective democracy projects, as we're exploring today, are complex and layered and nuanced, and they need a lot of different stakeholders to be effective and meaningful. So that's, my colleagues here today, in addition to librarians, educators, researchers, and other civil society actors. And all of that requires funding so that we can be nimble and responsive. And it's really exciting to hear Sharon talk about this new philanthropy, because we really need a world where funding comes in a way that is about shifting power and not just funding very specific projects for a specific group that require onerous reporting that totally misses the point. So it's really exciting to have a different potential future ahead there. But in terms of the challenge, Tanya, as you outlined here, is that the public just does not feel engaged or connected with policy development. If it's presenting as opaque, it's pushing people away. And it's not about shaming the public or the electorate. It's about doing a better job of engaging them and meeting them where they are. But there are reasons to be encouraged here. A practical way forward is through deliberative democracy, which is increasingly on the rise. And this is a practice where the public is viewed as a resource, not a risk. And it entails strengthening civic capacity of the public through processes like participatory budgeting and citizens' assemblies that invite the public into policy discussions and prioritize ensuring that they have a meaningful connection to the policy that they are helping to shape.
Thank you, Sabrina. Instructive and tangible as always. And I think that your point there is well taken, that public policy processes can be opaque, but citizens are not disengaged with the issues. And there are some key things that we need to prop up and build, like those safe spaces, educational opportunities, and supporting and developing our local media that has been deeply eroded. Although I did see some good news yesterday that there's been a large philanthropic gift in the United States to support local media organizations, understanding the important role that they play in democracy and civic engagement building. So hopefully we'll see more of that here in Canada. So Noah, maybe I'll turn it to you to share and highlight what are some of the gaps between the nonprofit sector and the government when it comes to funding democracy initiatives. What are some of your thoughts on how do we close that gap?
Thanks very much. So philanthropy cannot and should not support every social and public need. A lot of that should be filled by government, but not CCLA's work, because our independence is critical in order that we can do the work for democratic rights and freedoms against those in power, and in particular, the government of the day. That's what we do. And governments, frankly, cannot be counted on to support criticism against them. And that's why we need philanthropy to fill those gaps. That's why we need the generosity of people to allow us as well to be nimble and responsive. It wouldn't even be in our interest, even if they were offering it to us, to take subsidies from government or funding or grants, because we need to retain our independent voice without any pressure to bend or conform. And instead, we do our work on the basis of principle and how to be impactful for democratic rights and freedoms. So, for example, when we face off against government, it's to make sure that government is not overreaching in its powers and taking away people's freedom, that government is not discriminating or inadequately protecting or ignoring marginalized groups. There's an electoral system that makes governments want to take swift, strong action, but we are there to make sure that they look at the evidence, that they look at the science, that they incorporate that, and that they incorporate the Constitution, which includes fundamental rights and freedoms, and too frequently they don't. And again, that's our role. So we're able to be strictly non-partisan and independent through philanthropy and the broad-based supports for our project. And I want to say as well that dissent and protecting rights and freedoms often means protecting unpopular ideas. Some of them are going to always be unpopular because they're egregious, but some of them are unpopular yesterday and they become tomorrow's front page news. And it takes time and work by organizations like us to get us there, to understand that what today we see as an equality or a privacy or a justice issue was once considered a legitimate public interest, a legitimate public purpose. Whether it was segregation of people by race or non-recognition of same-sex marriage, they had reasons against it. I know, I was there. Whether it was the use of corporal punishment in prisons, or not understanding the needs of the rights of refugees, or courts being and legislatures being completely not caught up about technology and the need for privacy in cell phones and other forms of technology. And there are some topics that become popular in the public and some topics that are unpopular, like freedom of expression, which is important for everybody. Again, those whose opinions we like and those whose opinions we don't like. We're going to see now, I believe, that the same holds true for trans youth, that many of us understand that this is an equality issue. Right now, some people are saying that there's a reason to discriminate. That too will change, and it will take time, but it takes effort. And that effort is where philanthropy comes in, because it allows us and the many groups that we're working with to do our work.
No, I think you've highlighted an imperative, insight there that norms and values shift over time, and it is nonprofit and civil society organizations that support that shifting in perceptions around norms and values. And so it's important that you've highlighted that you're on the knife's edge of defending justice and rights, and we can't rely on government alone or or at all to support objective rights-based work that has a distinct point of view and that is nonpartisan in nature. So thank you for surfacing that. Sharon, I'd love to hear from you. What role do you think that cities, you're leading out one of the largest community foundations in Canada. What role do you think cities play in advancing democracy? And what are some of the observations that you've had over your years in this role in terms of the collaborations and discussions with other city-based foundations and what they're doing and how they're observing and evolving their role in this work?
Tanya, you're doing a great job. I can't believe how productively you are reflecting us back to each other and passing the baton. Just have to say that. I want to build on something Noah said first, which is connected. I promise it will segue, but it is the fact that there are those of us in the philanthropic space, and community foundations are certainly there. But to a certain extent, universities and big institutions that have assets that can play the long game. And kind of to Noah's point, we have got to have some institutions out there, and this is not a pro-endowment pitch, by the way. I'm typically kind of more balanced on the endowment thing. I'm not hardcore, but in these moments when you have to look out 20 or 30 years to actually see the kind of change that needs to happen, you do need philanthropy out there steady and able to stay engaged. And I think so that's just just reflecting on the societal contextual change, that sometimes we have to be patient to solve the hardest problems, and we have to hit community at the right time. Your question about cities, cities are the biggest spaces in which democracy exists. Not that democracy doesn't exist in rural Canada, but you've got all of these people living really close together. You often have capitals and centers of government sitting in cities. And it's where the power and the rhetoric and the hubris all come together in a beautiful chutney, as one of my colleagues said today. I thought it was a great metaphor, but it is where democracy is tested. It is where it is either respected or not. And so I think that we are important, dare I use another metaphor, petri dishes for experimenting with ways to challenge, to advocate, to mobilize. I think for us, the most relevant what's kind of on the top of my mind right now from Toronto Foundation's perspective is our next vital signs report, which will be coming out in November 15th. It'll be, I think, our 19th vital signs report. And last year we did, I think, some of the best research we've ever done. And Leslie and Civic Action were a partner on this, along with a whole bunch of others, to do this social capital report. Tanya, you mentioned social capital earlier, and I'll just speak to it a little bit, because I think social capital, which let's call it belonging, let's call it social cohesion, social connection, it's much less jargony, is the essential vital sign of any community. And I think what we're going to be talking about, I'll give those of you on this call a little sneak peek as we look ahead to vital signs, is the essentialness of community coming back together, grassroots up. And what does that look like? It could look like donating. It could like becoming a monthly donor to Samara. It could look like joining the local knitting circle. It could look like organizing a street party in your neighborhood. But what it doesn't just look like is like traditional civic engagement in the form of voting or policy work. And all of those things are essential, but it is our belief, based on the dramatic drop in civic engagement we've seen in Toronto in our social capital report, that it is an essential ingredient to rebuilding and pushing back against the forces that are trying to destroy democracy right now. And so I think that's really essential. The other thing I just have to say, and Anil Gokhale is in the audience. He works with me at Toronto Foundation, and he sent me a text, but I was already there, Anil. You all have to become subscribers to the local. This is my bag that I carried my computer here in today. The local is one of our grantees. It is a brilliant new media organization based in Toronto. I'm so proud to have been, it wasn't me, it was our team investing in the local for the last 3 years with a group of other funders in Toronto, because we felt the same way. The only way good democracy happens is when good journalism happens. These things are deeply interconnected. And yet we see with social media, and what all the wise women on this call have already highlighted, the fraying of the discourse. Just one example, the local was out in force at the very beginning of the vaccine rollout in the middle of the pandemic. And I don't know how many folks were aware of it, but they actually mapped the rollout the city was doing and pointed out to the city itself that in fact they were missing the most vulnerable neighborhoods with the lowest access to even pharmacies, let alone vaccines. And the story was picked up and made even bigger by the Toronto Star, and it completely changed the way the city rolled out vaccines for the rest of the pandemic with an equity lens, and is a great example of how a functioning democracy and a functioning, healthy local media can actually change things fundamentally for in a geographical region. So I think I'll leave it at that example, knowing that we're going to run out of time soon, Tanya, and we still got to hear from Leslie.
Sorry, as moderator, I've been a little more, I've been taking a little bit of liberty with my time, so I'll try and speed us along, but trying to create some connections between the dialogue. And I think what you said there, Sharon, in terms of social capital as a proxy for a feeling of belonging is the most imperative vital sign of the health of any community. And I think that your point around cities, by virtue of their size, are naturally creating a lot of entry points for folks to engage in the democratic process in lots of different ways. And so ensuring that we're funding that work, I think, is really important that you've highlighted. And I think all of our panelists have provided lots of suggestions for entry points that anyone joining this webinar today could find as ways to engage more deeply in the civic engagement and democratic process. And so, Leslie, I'm going to turn it to you to answer a final question, but also I'm going to give you a moment as well to do a final wrap up, and then we'll go in reverse order for final thoughts and comments. The next generation of democracy leaders are going to require different skills and experiences. And when I say experiences, of course, let's not think of that as only professional, but lived as well. What do you see as the potential for the next gen of civic leaders, and what role can community play in building democracy advocates and supporting those leaders as they rise and become quite unstuck?
Thanks so much. And so the perspective I bring to this question is from my own experience, having been part of and sat at numerous decision-making tables on complex issues in city building, whether it was in transit or in land development or in other things. So I bring a pretty practical attitude to what it is we're trying to accomplish. And to the question of understanding what is it we need to equip rising leaders with for them to take their place as best they can, it is the ability to understand, be self-aware, understand others, and know how to collaborate. And all our programs, some of you may know there's this thing called the social change wheel, and it says for change to happen, there are so many different players that we need. We need disruptors, we need diplomats, we need conveners, we need knowledge keepers, we need philanthropists, we need all of those types of leadership in order to move forward. And my experience on the ground has been the same, and that each of these understand that their role is not the definitive right way or approach. It's one of many that is going to make us move forward, and the ability to respect that is really critical. So teaching that and helping rising leaders understand that. And if you can all remember what it's like to be 21 or 22 and the world is your view is very pure. It is a learning, and through our Emerging Leaders Network, our Diversity Fellows, our Civic Match program, where we connect rising leaders to established leaders, and even at the program we launched last year around helping and training folks, Indigenous, Black, and racialized leaders, what they need to be fully equipped and present to sit at a not-for-profit or public board table, and to work with organizations themselves to understand how they can support that. It is, in my mind, one of the most essential things that we need more of, that we need to support, because in doing so, we enable leaders to build more confidence. They are equipped to have more skills about how to move between, as opposed to stand on a rock and scream. And so that ability to move between is what enables us to speed up the change that we need so badly. And I think the more that existing leaders, institutions understand that, the more they're able to see all that is in front of them, the individuals and the organizations, the not-for-profits. They understand them for the true value they really bring to the collective. And I think at Civic Action, and we'll do this when we bring all these folks together, really emphasize that individually everyone has a responsibility in this democratic system that we have, but more importantly, we have a collective responsibility, and we can't execute that responsibility if we don't understand we all hold a different view, a different role, but it's not a zero-sum game. It's not yours or mine or theirs or ours. It's together. And I think the thing that enables us to do is to push back in a stronger way against the forces that push to erode this notion that we have a common way forward that includes everyone, that it is for everyone, all humans that are in this ecosystem. And I think that I feel strongly and passionate about the work that we do is doing our part to move us forward. So my wrap up is, I don't know, I didn't prepare an extensive wrap up, thank goodness. But I did want to say, it's been a good exercise for me to answer the question that you posed to us, because in my day-to-day, I'm not sure I'm thinking about the connection between what I do to the underlying role of democracy, and the connection to what attracts or moves people to contribute, donate time, money, and energy to what we do. And so I am very grateful for the opportunity to have spent time in this space.
Thank you, Leslie. I think I'll give it over to Sharon, and then Noah, then Sabrina for 30 seconds or less. Just one thing would you like folks who have joined us here today to reflect on or take away from the discussion? And I will not intervene between the three of you. So Sharon, Noah, then Sabrina. Go ahead.
I want people to get back out there. I want them to go into their offices again, and I want them to connect with people. I want them to go join the local community theater group or the soccer club. I want them to donate again to organizations that truly need your donations, meaning smaller grassroots orgs doing this important work. I want them to volunteer for Meals on Wheels. I want them to just get back out there and engage with their community, get to know their neighbors, have their neighbors over for a drink, whatever that looks like. I promise you, our research shows, international research shows, your quality of life will improve, but the community quality of life will improve, and democracy will be better for it.
Go ahead, Noah.
We've been told that the arc of history bends towards justice, and maybe it does, but we've seen some pretty big rollbacks and attacks. And more importantly, Any movement towards justice happens because we made it happen. Or as a law professor of mine said, if we don't keep pushing forwards, we can also move backwards. So I want to end where I started. Democracy means voting, engaging, empowering, being empowered, informing, being informed, and participating in every way that we can and raising our voices.
Thank you. Sabrina, last word for you.
You know, Canadian culture is so tentative sometimes, and I think we're at the limits of that. And so this is a moment for courage and ambition.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, Sabrina, Noah, Sharon, and Leslie for what was definitely the high point of my week. And I hope that everyone that joined us today found it as enlivening, enriching, and thought-provoking as I did. It was a fantastic discussion, and I want to thank again our panelists for their time and their wisdom and their labor in this work outside of this 1 hour, all that they do to support and protect and uphold our democracy. Of course, I'd like to thank our lead sponsor for the Generous Future series, the TD Bank Group. Their leadership is truly commendable in supporting this kind of dialogue to take place. And finally, a thank you to our promotional partners, the Canadian Association of Gift Planners, Canada Helps, Imagine Canada, and the Community Foundations of Canada. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day and takes care, and hopefully found a call to action that inspires you to walk away and do something to support your community and to support our democracy. So thank you all for your time today, and that ends our discussion for this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.